Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Martin Klimke. I'm the program head of history at NYU Abu Dhabi and the vice provost for academic policies and governance. And on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, I'm pleased to welcome all of you this evening to 19 Washington Square, North NYU Abu Dhabi's home in New York. For those of you who are new to NYU Abu Dhabi or the Institute, let me tell you a little bit about it. Over the last decade, the Institute has established itself as a center of scholarly community for Abu Dhabi, the UAE, and the Gulf. As an extension of the programming we organize and the research we support in Abu Dhabi, and in an effort to foster greater intellectual and institutional connectivity between the two campuses, we also convene programs here in New York, just like the one we're here for tonight. And on that note, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker tonight, Maya Issam Kesrouany. Maya is a dear colleague from Abu Dhabi, who's also an assistant professor of literature and Middle Eastern studies. Her book manuscript, Prophetic Translation, The Making of Modern Egyptian Literature, was published with Edinburgh University Press in January of this year. And her current project investigates international cosmopolitanism of cultural production in North Africa and the Levant in the 20th century. Her research interests include nationalism and political imaginaries, cultural studies in the public sphere, and critical translation theory. After Maya's remarks, she will be joined by Professor Robyn Creswell, who will moderate a Q&A. I'm sorry, I'm joining in the other direction. Robyn, an associate professor of comparative literature, joined the complete department at Yale University in 2014 after teaching 2 years at Brown University. He's the author of City of Beginnings, Poetic Modernism in Beirut, published with Princeton University Press in 2019, a study of the modernist poetry movement in Arabic and its Cold War context. His current project is an intellectual history of the Arab world after World War II, told through the lives and works of its poets. Maya and Robyn, thanks so much for joining us tonight, and we're very much looking forward to a stimulating presentation and conversation after. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about why I was interested in doing this work in the first place. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Arabic translation of Albert Haddad's Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age, الفكر العربي في عصر النهضة by Karim Asghar. And in this book, Haddad had famously said that 1939 was the end of liberalism, the end of the Liberal Age. And ever since, many anthologies keep going back to that moment. Like, for example, recently, Jens Henson's and Max Weiss's 2018 Arabic Thought Against the Authoritarian Age, in addition as well to Arab liberal thought after 1967 by Mir Hatina. And always this return is to this to this pre-1967 moment, calling it liberal and calling it irrelevant to modern needs or what's happening to the Arab world today. Mir Hatina in particular explains this or describes this when she says that post-1967 Arab writers adopted the term liberal due to an affinity with the early liberal legacy of the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, specifically because these later writers delegitimized the experience of the 40s to the 60s as an era of radicalization, tyranny, and oppression. Now, given the great work that's been done recently to revise this accusation of liberalism, I see my book as trying to contribute to that discussion, as trying to frame this moment and to understand what was liberal about the early 20th century, particularly in Egypt, and particularly between the years 1910 and 1940, before the coming of Nasser. So I'm going to start by telling you a little story about one of the people that I read about. In April 1926, Egyptian writer known as the Dean of Arabic Literature, Taha Hussein, published his very controversial Fictional on Jahili or pre-Islamic poetry, with the profane claim that pre-Islamic literature was written during Islam, hence that Arabic was just a dialect and not a descended language, and that the prophets were speaking tribal languages, which were then collected as the Quran. As such, Hussein had designated the most sovereign truth, that Arabic was the unmediated word of God, the ultimate truth claim. Hussein himself was a success story of an Egyptian modernist literati from a poor family in the village, and blinded at 9 years old by traditional medicine. Hussein went on to study at Al-Azhar. In 1908, he was one of the first students to enroll in the Egyptian university, and then under King Farouk. Then he joined the Sorbonne, where he did a PhD in sociology under Durkheim, and came back to be a professor at the Egyptian University in 1919, right around the time of the revolution. Now back to him being on trial. On 30 May 1926, the Egyptian Sheikh Hassanian al-Talib of Al-Azhar Mosque issued an indictment against Hussein, who was at the time a professor, that he had blasphemed the Prophet in the book. On June 5, 1926, the indictment was escalated and signed by all the Sheikhs of Al-Azhar as stabbing the Prophet and calling for insurgency. The ministry had to respond to the collective indictment, and in June, Taha Hussein appeared in court again to defend himself. Now, I begin with this moment because I think it's an important moment in revising and going back to whatever constitutes liberalism in that moment. And I'll end this talk by going back to Taha Hussein being put on another trial in the 1950s by the Marxist critics in Beirut. So, first of all, I want to tell you about why I chose my people, because really my book is about 4 men, and I apologize for that. With all my respect to all men. The reason I chose them is because they were the most popular translators at the time. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by translation, but I'm just going to move through this slowly. I want to tell you a little bit about them first. So the first person, Mustafa Lutfi al-Manfaluti, was a very particular figure because he didn't speak any language other than Arabic, and had people read the European stories in Arabic to him, and then he would render them in writing. But he was the most popular writer, the most circulated, the most published, still very published today, available in every bookstore in Cairo, and I was in Cairo a month ago, so I can testify to that, still popular. I won't say much about Aqad and Nazimi, I'll come back to them, just because I want to make the talk a little bit briefer so we have more time for discussion. My second person was Muhammad al-Sibai, who was the father of the famous Yusuf al-Sibai, the Egyptian novelist. And Muhammad al-Sibai was studied at Madrasa al-Muallimin. He got a very colonial education. And I write especially about his translation of Carlyle's book on heroes, and also his translation of Dickens, and I'll talk briefly about that towards the end. The last 2 people I talk about are Muhammad Hussein Haykal and Taha Hussein. I've already told you a bit about Taha Hussein. Muhammad Hussein Haykal as well was someone who studied at the Sorbonne, very educated. What I write about particularly is his biography of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which he publishes in 2 volumes in 1921 and 1923 in Cairo. And I use the word tarjama, which means biography and interpretation at the same time, to talk about his particular adaptation of the life of the French philosopher. So I chose them for all these reasons. I chose them because each one of them has a different translation style. Manfaluti was complete adaptation, complete iqtibas, while Muhammad al-Sibai did a lot of literal, faithful translation. Hussein and Haykal did a little bit of both, but they both produced biographies, so they used tarjama in the Arabic sense of biography, but also in the Arabic sense of interpretation, bringing together the words of the authors that they were translating with their own words. Of course, there were a lot of challenges to picking them as well, because circulation is hard to understand. The circulation of these texts is hard to understand in that period. We don't have much documentation of who was reading what was being published, who was publishing what. What we do know is that they were definitely reading each other, they were definitely talking to each other. Muhammad al-Sibai's translation of A Tale of Two Cities was a text in the schools. He translated it in 1912, and it was taught in all the colonial schools in Cairo at the time. Mustafa Lutfi al-Manfaluti was taught in high schools, still taught in high schools in Egypt. So with some it's you can get a better sense than others. But they were definitely talking to one another, and that was one of the reasons I was interested in what they were doing as well. were editors of very popular journals in Egypt at the time. They were writing with each other, they were writing against each other, and they were writing to each other. Particularly Mohammed Hussein Haikal and Taha Hussein were also ministers in the government, and so they played a very important political role. And Taha Hussein became the head of the translation initiative under Jamal Abdel Nasser later on. So, just a little bit more, Mustafa al-Manfaluti studied at Al-Azhar as well for 10 years, so he has that background. And all four of them engaged with Romanticism. So Mustafa al-Manfaluti translates Chateaubriand, the noble savage figure, particularly in 1919. And then this particular figure is also the constitutive for the translation of Rousseau by Haikal. So Romanticism played a very important role in mobilizing their agendas, their prophetic agendas as translators and writers in Egypt at the time. Of course, Muhammad al-Sibai's translation of Thomas Carlyle's On Heroes is all about Muhammad the Prophet. So he translates the two lectures on Muhammad the Prophet and on Shakespeare, the poet. And he brings these two ideas together to produce the poet prophet in Egyptian culture. So my interest in this book was threefold, really. One was to rethink this critique of liberalism and go back to this moment to understand what these different liberal agendas were and what translation had to do, particularly literary translation, in mediating them. My second interest was in looking at translation as adaptation. And to think about how using translation or studying translation as something that is not faithful to our original, in fact, moves us away from the novel, moves us away from realism, towards experimentation, and towards allowing for multiple discourses to exist in contestation together at the same time. My last interest was in the relationship between religion and literature. To understand particularly the transformation of morality and the role of adab between Al-Azhar and the secular, in this case. So in my book, I end up using the word profane, not the word secular. And I'll come back to that maybe a little bit more in Q&A. But I just want to show you, so I did a lot of research in Egypt to try to get a sense of what was being published. The first findings show us, at least in the 19th century, from the first half to the second half, the number of so adab literature is the one before the last. You see the increase from 19 to 105 recorded texts in translation between the first half of the 19th century and the second half. From my research in Egypt and in Beirut, this is some of the data I collected on who was being translated, where and in what way. So I found 8 translations of Chateaubriand, 12 of Bernadette de Saint-Pierre, about 80 of Guy de Maupassant, about 15 of Victor Hugo, and many of Alexandre Dumas Solitaire and Zebako and Goethe, and lots of, a little bit of Voltaire, and I'll get to that in a second, and lots of detective fiction as well, which of course now there's been a lot of conversation about. My motivating question throughout, in looking at all these translations and trying to figure out where they fit and what they look like, was to think about why they would appropriate the form of the novel and not poetry. So what was it about the novel and narrative and prose that appealed to them? And why was it easier to adapt and change narrative in the work that they were doing? And one of the things I got to, or at least what was very interesting in terms of thinking about liberalism and their project or their uses of translation, was particularly the way that they critiqued the sovereignty of the individual. So what they were trying to do in remapping narrative strategies of representing the world in fiction was also decentering the individual, decentering the narrator as the owner of truth, as the speaker of truth, which is very constitutive of the realist novel, and particularly what we see happening with Dickens. So I wanted to understand what can we learn from returning to this previous moment? If we're not interested in redeeming these figures, which I'm definitely not, but rather in establishing a historical understanding of the use of translation to adapt and contextualize foreign thought. So as I explore the intimacy of translation precisely as this in-between, I call it a third space, and I'll get to that in a minute, accounts of blasphemy with which I open this talk matter much less to me than the ways in which their translations rearrange and reconfigure modes of signification within the text and through translation. Now, because translation was always a playful act for these authors, because they moved away from the original, because no one would really call it translation in most cases, famous critics and most popular critical accounts, as you see here, I've summarized a lot of them, will use the word failed repeatedly. So these texts are failed imitations, failed reproductions of an original. And in general, the agreement is that this failure is also because these texts or these translations fail to produce coherent narrative subjectivities, that there are no subjects produced, and so they don't constitute novels, and so they fail. They fail as translations and they fail as novels. Now, this one. Before I get into why I wanted to use the word prophetic in talking about them, I want to give you a sense of why this subject on morality was so important for this moment in the 19th century and early 20th century. So this is one of the editorial introductions to Al-Muqtatar, a journal which began being published in Beirut and then moved to Cairo. And it said, if we were to examine the anxiety of the young, we would find that the root of the problem is the kind of love relationships young people commit themselves to at an early age. Novels and poetry dealing with love themes and the like can only make matters worse. This kind of writing is addictive. One thing leads to another, and the end result would be a waste of time and a lowering of standards. These desires must be curbed. So these authors that I'm dealing with and the ways and the creative ways in which they use translation were fighting against this on the one hand. And this brought with it a whole understanding of the novel being a secondary form, a lower form that would corrupt the morals of the generations to come. So they had to defend their project in some way. And one of the ways that I found that they used to defend their project was to resort to the prophetic. And the prophetic, in my analysis, functions on three levels. On the first level, they see themselves and present themselves as cultural prophets. So Hussein, for example, in 1955 will defend his generation's mission as necessary critique and not literary creation, as opposed to the romantics in North America who have time to create, who will say, like Gibran, he only has time to produce critique. Second, they do write about the Prophet and Islam. And third, the prophetic is a narrative category that is produced for them through borrowing romanticism. So for me, the prophetic is not at all a transcendental position, it's analytical. It's born within the text itself. And it really comes as a way to present a different way of using language, to produce the word and language in a new way, to challenge the way that language has been used in the past, both against what they perceived as what Al-Azhar was doing, but also against producing Western literature the way that it was. So when colonial translation promised facts and truth based on the European master text, and some Arab reformists confirmed the superiority of philosophy to religion, we actually find that a close engagement with these translations complicates such niche cultural translation, because the translations and not the translators reveal a discomfort with the European terms of modernity, such as a definitive subject, and the projected futurity complicit in the project of colonial modernization. So for me, the fact that they failed to produce narrative subjectivities, that they failed to produce novels is actually a success. Because in failing, they are also failing to reproduce teleologies. They are failing to fall for the colonial trap of a progressive temporality. And so even if in some of their declarations they espouse a liberal project, and these are the main accusations against them, in fact their actual work, and particularly their literary translations, become a space of playfulness, a space of critique, a space where all of these things get undone, including their own reformist agenda. So I want, in the interest of time, I want to move to, sorry, Mustafa Lutfi Manfaluti and give you a little bit of a case study. And then we can have more discussion. I'll tell you more about how I was seeing translation work in this book. But back to Al-Manfaluti, who is a very interesting figure because, like I told you, he did not know any language other than Arabic and had all of these texts read to him by his very good friend. And then he would render them into whatever form he saw fit at the time. So plays turned into short stories, into novels. And Mustafa Lutfi Manfaluti was very interesting because he was known at the time as Imam al-Bayan, the master of form. He was trained in classical forms, and he only used Fusha, he only used classical Arabic in all of the work that he produced. He's still very much read today, and translation in his work can only be described as creative adaptation. It's neither foreignizing nor domesticating, and somehow it's simultaneously both. But for me, his work captures the problem of this era very, very, very well. Because in all the accusations about him, the words that come up are al-mu'allif, al-katib, and al-mutarjim. So the writer, the creator, and the translator. And all of these terms become forms of accusation against him, always based on his person. So the Romantics will accuse him of being a mu'allif and a failed katib. All he does is sort of reproduce other ideas, but he's not a katib, he's not original, he's not producing something new. Some other people will call him a mutarjim, which really indicts him of just being an interpreter of other people's thoughts. What's interesting is in all of these debates, the word mutarjim never really refers to translation. It just refers to bad interpretation, bad rendering of your own thoughts in your own language, but not of another time. And no one ever spoke about the fact that Al-Manfaluti's work was stolen translations for the most part. He produced a lot of adaptations that do not name the original, do not mention the original author at all. And in the few cases where he does mention the original author, he nonetheless changed the genre entirely. But he became the center of all these debates between the realists and the romantics and everyone else. So for the realists, Madhab al-Haqa'iq at the time, the problem with Al-Manfaluti was he used too many details in reproducing romanticism, and so he cannot produce any universal truth. Nothing he says could be of value. For the romantics, the problem was in fact the opposite. He used too much rhetoric, he used too much classical Arabic, he was too much exteriority, not too much interiority, and so he's irrelevant to the needs of modern times. Again, all of these debates ignore the fact completely that what he was producing in the end were translations and not his own works. So he ends up writing a whole bunch of articles. While he's producing his translations, he's writing articles prolifically, especially for a journal called Al-Mu'ayyid, which at the time had particular liberal leanings. But every Thursday, his article would come out, and all the readers would wait for it, and wait for his translations at the same time. And what's interesting is that in the actual articles, he was always offering a critique of modernity, a critique of colonialism, a critique of colonial ideology, and a critique of translation being an act of accurate borrowing. Then all of these articles are collected into 3 volumes known as Al-Nazarat. And in the introduction to the first volume is where he actually lays out his own theory of translation. When Walter Benjamin wants translation to forego communication at all, Al-Manfaluti presents his language as an invisible vessel that transmits the truth of his imagination, the moral destined for the reader. So just like language is meant to be a transparent representation of the idea, this is how he presents it in the introduction to this collection, the original is only incidental. The translation is the primary text, and the original finds its actual form only in the translation. In his theory, literal translation produces convoluted forms and makes a bad writer, who compensates for inadequate thoughts just, and I'm quoting, this is a translation of his work, like a foreigner who thinks that the Arabic language is letters and words. So his speech sounds like literal, harfiya, translations in Arabic. So what happens in his theory of translation is that actually literal or accurate translation is bad translation. Because what it does is reproduce the structures of the original as it is in the native tongue. And that for him meant you would carry colonial ideology or Western thought as it is into the target culture. To guard against that, you would have to appropriate. You would have to make your own language and your target culture and your target community of receivers take precedent over the original text and forgo the original text. It is a very sophisticated theory of translation, and he sort of put this translation theory together as early as 1919, because it's also a theory of expression. So while for the realists, mimesis or using documentary realism would be the only way to guarantee the production of good literature, solid literature that would produce truth, Al-Manfaluti understood that in fact, language is always going to be a form of mediator. And so there's always going to be this baggage contained in the language that you use. And the way that he tries to get away from this baggage, at least in his understanding, I'm not saying he succeeded or not, but what I'm saying is he actually understood that you cannot, that language makes a claim on meaning, that it makes a claim on the world. And he wanted to use translation to offer a different form, a different theory of expression that would allow or disable those other meanings from coming through intact as they are. And in that sense, for me at least, he was much more aware of the receiving community. He was much more aware of the contingent historical moment that he was in. And his use of bayan, while for some people was very alienating, his use of classical Arabic forms and classical Arabic, in fact, always heeded the community that was receiving it. So he knew that these forms would reach the community he had in mind. And translation for him, when the production of meaning, was always happening in that space in between the katib and the receiver. It was never localized in the subject of the katib or the author. While that was the case for the Romantics writing at the time, and that was also the case for the Realist writing at the time. So while all these different groups, in fact, alienated their readers and their communities, Mustafa al-Manfaluti was able to draw them in. And if you look here, for example, at Ash-Sha'ir, the poet, which was an adaptation of the Rostand Cyrano de Bergerac, and he wrote that in 1921. In the introduction, he says, "I've tried to abide by the original in its entirety and controlled myself to only remove sentences that were of no importance or added only expressions that were necessary for the context. He who reads the Arabicized version is reading the actual French original. I changed it from a play into a short story so that the reader can see it on paper as the audience sees it in the theater." And here you get a very clear sense of this project. So this was his theory of translation, and then his practice of translation actually did the same thing. It was a performance of this understanding that translation should be and should become a theory of expression. And that's why, for me, in fact, his use of translation is also the moment of birth of literary criticism in the Arab world. And I can come back to that because it's a bit complicated. So I want to give you one example from Al-Abrad, and I'll stop so that we can have more time for discussion. Al-Abrad, it's translated as the tears, but it also can mean morals or lessons. It was published in 1915, and it had 4 small, short original stories and 4 translations. Of course, it took me about 9 months to figure out that these were translations, and then about 3 months more to figure out what they were translations of, because that's what he did skillfully. So one of the ones that I was fascinated by, and then you can take a look, you can see the rest. Al-Fadila, Virtue, or Paul et Virginie, is a translation of Paul et Virginie in 1923, which was famously published in 1789 with the French Revolution. Super interesting text, and I don't have time to get into it now, but I definitely can in Q&A. But I want to talk a little bit about what he does in one of his stories called Al-Shuhada, Al-Martyrs or Witnesses, which is included in Al-Abrad, which was published in 1915, and which after a lot of digging and excavation I actually found out is a combination of René and Atala. So he took Chateaubriand's 1,000-page work and made it into a 20-page aphoristic short story. But it's a very interesting adaptation, and one of the reasons it is so interesting is one of the ways that Manfaluti will practice his theory of translation is he will take the elements of romanticism, such as vague de passion, the loss of the self, and he will treat those elements very realistically. And I'll show you what that means. He will actually objectify the subjective internal conflicts of the characters. He will objectify them into objects and things that are existing in the world. And this exteriority, this externalization of emotion is in fact something very, very understandable by his community and easier for his community to relate to. So that's another way in which his adaptation was functioning. It wasn't just changing the original in its entirety, but it was also changing the elements of the original, adapting romanticism so that it would be made to speak to an Arabic context, 1915 Cairo to be exact. So in the Arabic, وإذا هو نفسه قطعة من تلك القطع هائمة بيننا هيمان الروح الحائر في ظلمات القبور فما قد يعرف مكانه منها فمشى في ذلك المعترك المائج يفتش عن نفسه ويتلمسها بيده تلمسا حتى سمع listen to this صلصلة السلسلة ملتفة على قدميه فوجدها وكان قد أجهده المسير فتساقط على نفسه باكيا ملتحبا. And I'll translate poorly, but I'll try. And so he himself was a piece of the pieces, drifting aimlessly like a confused soul in the darkness of the graves, not knowing his place in the darkness. So he walked in the stormy, and Ma'aj is actually wavy, but the implication here is more stormy, battlefield, searching for himself and feeling for it with his hand until he heard the rattling of the chain wrapped around his feet, and he was exhausted from walking, so he fell on himself, crying and wailing. And you see this objectification here that I've been taught, this externalization of the self. Anything that's in any internal crisis is externalized in the use of pronouns, in literally encountering yourself in the darkness of the grave. And my argument in the book in general is that the use of I, when it comes up for these translators, particularly because they use translation as adaptation and critique, in fact arrests any understanding of the sovereignty of an individual self. And the I, in particular for Al-Manfaluti, really partakes in what I'm calling more of an idea of a person, a logic of personhood and not subjectivity. And it develops in this communion between the writer and the receiving community. Becomes a critique of Enlightenment ideals of the whole self, becomes a critique of romanticism on the way. And he uses translation as playful adaptation to do that. And so in that sense, in my analysis, he ends up deconstructing the representational logic that privileges realism as a producer of truth. So just to conclude, in 1954, Taha Hussein is called and put on a different trial, and this time it's in Beirut. He's called to Beirut by Raif Khoury, by the journal Al-Adab, which at the time had a debate called لمن يكتب الكاتب? Who does the writer write for? And Taha Hussein, with whom I began, who was put on trial by Al-Azhar in 1926 for being blasphemous, is now put on trial by the Marxists for being elitist. And it's an interesting kind of come full circle, and this is, bringing me back to my question about what is liberalism and how are these authors understood in retrospect. But I think it's a very important punctuating moment, and one that is, making a comeback even today, and thinking about these Hussein and others as these forefathers, and what they actually said versus what I tried to show in my book they were in fact saying throughout the earth, or different types of writing that they were doing. In the decades after the translation studied in this book, accounts of the rise of the novel, the Arabic novel, systematically frame these earlier phases of compounded literary aesthetics and translation as a failed teleology. So they fall out of any story of how we came to the good literature that we have today. How the good novel is the novel that is Najib Mahfouz, but anything that happens before on the trajectory to getting to him, like these adaptations, are failed. They do not count. And then the socialist realists of the 1950s who put Taha Hussein on trial also make a very similar accusation of Taha Hussein and his generation. What they want to critique is a romantic subjectivity of these elite writers. So they understand these elite katibs of the early 20th century to be elitist, to have produced a sort of solipsistic subjectivity, to have written only for themselves and about themselves, and not engage their surroundings and their context in any real way. And all writers and critics today signal this 1954 debate as the moment of the end of the adib, the end of the intellectual of the early 20th century, the end of Taha Hussein. But I want to revise that a little bit, because while the Marxists believed that they were using realism to produce a more accurate collective critique of a supposedly easily representable collective consciousness, I think that the translations that were being done in the early 20th century, in fact, use foreign forms and hold on to translation as this problematic space of adaptation that never really achieves its purpose, never really becomes accurate, never really becomes ideal. I think in that failure, in that space to fail, is precisely where the tension between what is subjective and what is realistic is held on to, and precisely the space in which the collective and the receiver and the reader is much more faithfully engaged than the criticism that is launched against them post the 1950s. So I didn't write this book to redeem them or to defend them. I wrote this book to engage with their translations closely, in line with their critical work. So in every chapter I do both. I look at their translations, but I also look at their entire work. And I try to look at them together, and I try to look at them in the historical moment that shaped them and all the discourses that they were referring to at the time, whether it was European philosophy or Islamic forms that they were familiar with. But in doing that, in trying to map out this historical moment from 1910 really to 1950, my intention was to think of translation as a way to revisit what was considered liberal at the time. Because what we find out by really engaging with these years and these decades is that for every one of these authors, liberalism looked different. And the project looked different, and who the subject was looked different, and who the audience was looked different, and what change would look like also looked different. And I'm hoping that my use of translation in this book would shed some light on these pre-1967 writers. Thank you.
So I'm very pleased to be in conversation with Maya this evening about her really fascinating new book, which touches on so many different themes of realism and the limits of realism and national imaginaries and translation and the history of the Arabic novel and the emergence of the Arabic novel. And a really important virtue of the book, as it seems to me, is that it gives us a large new archive of things to look at as scholars and readers. I think, you mentioned in the book, Franco Moretti's complaint that, if we really want to understand what's going on in the English novel, that is a British novel in the 19th century, we can't keep reading the same 200 books because 8,000 of them were published after all over the course of that century. And we can't just read, the peaks. And similarly, I would say, simply reading Soft al Soft and Ardat al Ruh and Bayham al-Tasrain will give us a certain story about telling of the Arabic novel and its emergence and its relation to what are conventionally considered European models. But if we expand, as your book, I think, does and suggests that we do more of, then other stories become possible. I also wanted to say that, or another way of putting that, actually, I think, which you may or may not second, I think you would, is to say that we can't simply read the successes. We also have to read things that failed. Because that gives us a way of thinking about, what counts as success in a novel. It defamiliarizes the very notion of that and gives us new ways of reading the things that we thought we knew, let's say, the chronicle works, in addition to giving us new things to read. So, another exciting thing, it seems to me, about the book is that it studies a relatively neglected corpus of narrative, prose, including translation. So the long 19th century of the Nahda, from the Napoleonic invasion to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, let's say, has been given a certain amount of scholarly scrutiny and attention over the last, let's say, decade. Quite a bit, I would say, in fact, and has given us a new way of thinking about the Nahda. That's been great. Similarly, the post-World War II period has also been, I would say, pretty, well scrutinized. But the early 20th century, the entre-guerre period that you're really looking at, has been sort of neglected. So that's exciting too, that it sort of points to this gap in the scholarly record. And so my first question is, if you agree more or less broadly with that kind of way of describing the situation, what led you to these works? Like, how did you come upon them? What piqued your interest about them, and what about, in particular, the translations? Because they're not, for the most part, novels, or not simply novels that you're reading. So what was it that led you to this period, in particular, these personages?
Cairo. I was in Cairo in 2006, and I was doing archival research, and I started finding them one by one. First, I found a lot from the late 19th century. That was a bit easier to track. And then I stumbled on some of Mataluti's stuff, but also a lot of other translations that were happening at the same time, of Chateaubriand and others. And that's how I got them. And I started reading them, and I thought they were fascinating because they all had prefaces in which the author and the translator was thinking about what he was doing. And I thought, how great that there's actually, thought going into this. It's not just I'm taking something and adapting it. I'm thinking about how I'm doing it. So I wanted to understand that a little bit more. And then, of course, the people that I chose are such, well, at least for Taha Hussein and Heiga, they are controversial figures, and they're figures, there was a lot written on them, but not much has engaged with that other side of them, the side where they were negotiating with all these things and trying to understand the role that their European education played in their lives and their positions as ministers of education. And so that's why I ended up also going to them and not staying with the multiple other popular adaptations that I found of these texts. So I wanted sort of a combination. I wanted to understand translation in this interwar period as these multiple performances of complete adaptation, accuracy, but also biography. Why would you write the life of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1921? What would that do? And then the way that this writing was done, the critique, the understanding of what writing was doing, the failures of democracy, why we need a nation state, which emerges in Heggel's conversation with Rousseau, for example, was fascinating to me. And the fact that this was all placed in a critical discourse on translation, that translation would be the way to negotiate these things. And all four of them talk about that incessantly, that there would be a way for East and West to meet, but this meeting would not necessarily be pleasant, and it would always be one that unfolds in translation, and in some ways will always be open and open for revision. So I felt that the reformist ambitions were too.
I wonder too if one reason why, and I'd be interested to hear what you had thought about this, why is it that, if it's true that, somehow this period falls between two stools which have received much more attention, why is that? Why should that be? And I wonder if part of the, and only part, but part of the explanation would be, is because it has been, especially in Egypt, of course, tagged as the period of liberalism, the kind of high point of liberalist thought. And insofar as liberalism is just, the ideology of the middle class, and therefore an excuse for the status quo, and therefore boring, it's not the most exciting period to look at. And whereas it does seem to me that an argument might be made, and I don't know if this is an argument you would make, but that the history of liberalism, which is not a singular history, it's not a simple sort of history in the Arab world in the 20th century, its relationship to cultural experimentation is a very interesting one. So that, for instance, I'm only talking about this because I happen to have studied it, but in the post-war period, a magazine like Sha'ab in Beirut, in which liberalism plays, I think, a very prominent sort of role, was also arguably the most experimental avant-gardist sort of magazine in the region. So that there are various moments, and one could, even extending up to the present, one could make an argument that, Arab Spring uprisings have a very central liberal political ideology, and yet they are, if not radical, at least they're upsetting of some sort of status quo. Anyway, I wonder if you would say, if you think too that one of the reasons for the neglect of this period has to do with the centrality of liberalism to it. Then I have some questions about what liberalism does mean in this period.
Yes, I think so. I think this period in particular has been, if anything, either romanticized or condemned. So it's either that, this was the moment for some critics, fewer than others. The dream of the second would be based on the first Nahda, and this first Nahda takes place between the 20s and the 40s for them. And Taha Hussein figures as this kind of liberal, democratic. Is it better now? Yes. Yes. Okay, good. So you can still hear it? No, I hear it. It's everywhere. So yes, it became this kind of blind spot for some reason. It's either we don't really, in either case, no one really engages with what was happening, but it's always in this imaginary. It's either a really good thing or a really bad thing.
What if I just talk? You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's not too bad. We have enough noise in our lives.
I still use mine.
It's
my
turn. On the spotlight then. Is that better? What was your second question?
Well, no, you were saying about the degree to which okay, it's either viewed as a high point or else it's a low point.
I think what's amazing about this period is that there were so many points, and there were so many appropriations, and so many adaptations, and so many conflicting narratives, even by these supposed men of liberalism. parsing this out. So I wanted personally to understand a little bit more, because even when you give the example of the Arab Spring or what's going on in Beirut today, for example, there are many conflicting narratives about what is this, who's mobilizing this? Does it look like something we've seen before? Does it look like this? Is it liberal? Is it not? And I guess my question is, does it have to be even more? Like, can we understand the complexities of what it is and what it isn't? What it's borrowing, what it's not borrowing, what it's negotiating, and what it's failing to negotiate, in some sense.
So, maybe you want to resist any attempt to kind of summarize what liberalism would mean in this period. But you did mention that one of the ways of understanding these writers' investment in translation as a kind of historical act, let's say, and also a political act in some ways, is the way that it destabilizes the author function, let's say. That sometimes you don't know who's really doing this writing in some ways, and that this seems to have been a more or less conscious decision on their part to critique, let's say, a certain kind of subjectivity. Now, this is what I wanted to ask about. Insofar as the figure of the prophet, as it's transmitted both through the classical Arabic tradition, which has a long history of that, and then also through European Romanticism, that's uses a shorthand. The prophet is some sort of, but there is some sort of like egotistical sublime. On the one hand, you seem to be saying that they are prophets, but then on the other hand, you seem to be saying they're criticizing precisely that sort of transcendental position or a stable authorial position through their translations. And so, say a little bit more about that, and then say also how it links to their liberalism, because I think conventionally one would say liberal political ideology has everything to do with the centering of the individual. So
yes, some of them do actually. Some of them actually do draw on Islamic traditions or Arabic traditions of prophecy. Faruti will famously begin his Nazarat by saying, I have a poor memory, and so all I'm giving you are impressions of what's coming to me from a distance. And what's coming to him from a distance is really the translated text that is reading it to him. He'll never, So the divine source becomes this sort of adapted translated text, which I find fascinating. So for Al-Aqad and Al-Mazini, who I didn't have time to talk about much today, they were very versed in that tradition as well. So they call on it, but they also call on Shelley, and there's a combination of both these traditions. So the poet as seer, Shah, as someone who can see beyond and see through. And this is the kind of prophecy, and that's why for them it's also born in their adaptations and in their works so it's not transcendental. What I'm saying is, in fact, it is not transcendental. It is an analytical position that is born from within their texts and not imposed on the world outside their text through their text. So it's how can the subject position within the text be played around with, so that it becomes an analytical critique of truth rather than the reproduction of truth as it is. And that becomes a critique of sovereignty, the sovereignty of the individual. So for example, you'll see Hamad al-Sibai in adapting Dickens, he replaced the third person narrator with God. So there's no omniscient narrator, there's God. Kama qala Allah. So it's always God who's going to actually put things in place and give you the knowable, and not the third person narrator. So, and then you'll see shifts in pronouns repeatedly that call to that, and externalization that we see with Manfaluti. With Taha Hussein, it's fascinating because it becomes, he starts by translating Sophocles and Aristotle, and begins by critiquing democracy and the sovereignty of the individual self, and And then he goes and adapts André Gide's rewriting of Theseus and uses that to go back to some kind of idea of fate which surpasses the individual. So rewrites, it's a very complicated thing that he does, but he rewrites French rewritings of Greek mythology through Al-Ma'arif, calling on fate as the ultimate, ultimately you're fated to do these things, and you don't have that kind of agency and that kind of central role in what you do. So those are the ways in which, so you're right, it wasn't just novels that I was looking at, they were adapting all sorts of things. So they were adapting poetry and plays, but eventually they were going to the form of the novel. So it was André Gide and Voltaire who helped Taha Hussein go back to Aristotle and understand Antigone and understand Theseus. So I was interested in those multiple levels of translation and what that had to do with their liberal project, writing from the moment that they were writing. So there was no one way of understanding this liberalism. I don't think they understood it in one way. This is why this is so interesting. They're accused of having reproduced some kind of liberal ideology, but if you really read their entire oeuvre, understand the moment they were in, and even their role in parliament, for example, and what they were saying there, it really, really complicates what kind of liberalism they thought they understood. And they were reading everything and translating everything as well. So for them, it was also coming to them as a critique from the first place. So that's why the prophetic is always an analytical and never a transcendental position.
So remaining within this space of the prophetic, one of the more provocative, I guess, sentences in your book, you say, and this is a way to ask you to talk about the profane, one of your key categories, which you mentioned during the lecture, but you say in profaning the originals, the translations that you're studying, return both the literary and the sacred to the public sphere and address to the reader. This is the provocative sentence. What they tell us, in other words, is that fiction and Islam are not incompatible. In fact, they have been, as you point out, been declared incompatible by, among other people, in the essay that those people don't read anymore, by Edward Said, in fact, who says something like, I'm paraphrasing, but that Islam imagines some sort of totalized, represented world, and therefore has no need for the imaginary world of novels or something like this. I don't think this is something that he later on will probably subscribe to. This is an early essay, but he's not the only one who makes a claim like that. So, but could you say something about profane? Say something about why it would even be imagined that Islam and the novel are somehow compatible?
Well, at least in this period, it was also morality that was an issue, right? So, like the quote that I showed from Al-Muqtada. So, one, Islam would be the only way to provide a moral education and should provide that on its own, through its own body of literature. And that novels and fiction, because they introduce characters who are like real people going through real things, could provide a space of identification for the readers that potentially could be dangerous because they offer a different thought on morality or what the moral is. So Mustafa Manfaluti again plays an interesting role in this because he produces a lot of Islamic articles. Really, he sort of changes the genre. So he starts by writing them as articles for Al-Mu'ayyad, and then there's a whole body of work written about the al-Maqala that he created, and which is a Maqala Islamiyya, where he uses Islamic stories and Islamic traditions, let's say, to communicate to the public sphere this kind of morality, and he links it to the translations that he's doing and the stories that he is producing to sort of offer a way in which both these things can ultimately be doing the same thing or moving towards the same target. And that for me, so I was using profane because I'm just simply secular. And one of the ways I wanted to think about profanation is bringing something back into public use, bringing something back into the community. So not keeping texts away from the public sphere, not keeping access to particular ideas away from the public sphere, but finding ways to mediate them to the public sphere. And not in a way that, again, one of the accusations against these translators or these people from this liberal age is that they also separate religion from, so religion is relegated to the private sphere and they want the public sphere to have no religion, so of course the government, the state would have nothing to do with Islam, etc., etc. And my point is not necessarily to participate in those conversations, but rather to think about how their own translations try to profane that separation. So how can we think about morality produced by both these forms of text and circulated in the public sphere, and not to privilege necessarily one over the other. So profanation worked for me in that sense, taking something that's supposed to be sacred and placed in a space on its own and recirculating it.
Is there something that happens during this period to, you mentioned a public sphere, and it's always a debate among historians, when the public sphere in any given place or nation actually emerges and what the conditions for that emergence are. But I do wonder, since the way you describe profanation is to bringing it out of the temple and putting it in front of the temple, which is what profanation means, in fact. Bring it out into the square. How do these authors that you're studying, how do they imagine their audience? Because they are often accused, in retrospect and sometimes at the time, of being elitist. But is there a change during this period in the way that writers imagine their audience, do you think? I mean, do they have some kind of conception of a public sphere, and is it different from what you would have found 20 years previously?
I think they were very aware that the majority of the people were not educated and unable to read. So Taha Hussein was on a campaign most of his life to make education free for everyone, and she succeeded to do it in 1944 for that reason. There's an awareness and an address to that. And so one of the reasons he produces the livre de poche is, he says, and those are all adaptations of popular French plays and not canonical texts in any way. And he reproduces them in very short pieces, and those were very, very well circulated and very popular to those who can read, of course. But he was very aware in producing those that this would be a form of translation that would communicate a certain moral in an interesting way to the majority of readers, right? Manfaluti was always aware, and he was always a popular reader. And in fact, what Ahmed Hassan al-Zayed says about al-Mu'ayyid, that al-Manfaluti's readers used to wait every Thursday for his articles, and that they would wait for it because they would actually describe his language as prophetic, almost like they're waiting for his prophecy every week. So he was, we know, a very, very well-read and popular writer. But they all, I think perhaps I would say Haykal the least, because Haykal had a certain understanding of his elitism that was a bit different from the others. But they were all very much aware of who that recipient is. They were scared of the masses in some cases. As Sibai would call them at some point al-Duhana, in fear of revolution. And he writes his book. He writes Al-Abtal as a translation of Carlyle in 1911, but then in 1920 he writes Abtal Misr, where he takes Carlyle and applies him to Egypt. And it's a very interesting book because in the introduction to that book, that's where he's super aware of how this applies to the moment and the context that he's in, and also the people who are going to receive this lecture. So what are they going to think of heroism, for example? because it could also be profane. The hero as this kind of the agent, the subject of history, the mobilizer. And in Abtal Misr, he does this wonderful thing, and he says, when Thomas Carlyle cast on Egypt his ideas of change theoretically, well, Egypt went and cast back on him and her ideas practically, right? And this is before the independence and before the new constitution. But there is this understanding already that what is happening in Egypt and these different political parties that are born and these different ways of thinking about heroism and history and the trajectory of history are recasting and rewriting this theory of liberalism that's coming in. And those are the ways in which I started to detect that there's a consciousness of who the receivers are as readers, but also as subjects of history.